Good morning. This is week 10 of the Introduction to Cultural Studies, and today we'll start a short section of the semester devoted to ideology, politics and power. So rather unpleasant subjects if you think about that, but the subjects that really influence our daily lives. And if some of you may think, as I guess many people, especially young people do, that you are not interested in politics, perhaps think again. Everyone has political views, and if you are not interested in politics, then it's quite likely, unfortunately, that the politics will get interested in you. So let's see. This is basically a historical overview of the current political spectrum in Europe, and also some of the general concepts like what is the left, what is the right, and how to tell the difference. So the first slide here is the concept of the meta-narratives or the grand narratives. This is something taken from a rather influential book by Jean-François Lyotard, The Postmodern Condition. He came up with this idea to denote overarching stories that legitimize power relations. So grand narratives, the big stories, it's like mythologies really. It could be mythologies, it could be something not connected to actual narrations, actual storytelling, something like the Enlightenment or Marxism or religions like Christianity, for example. So these are the stories that legitimize power relations. So these are the beliefs that are at the basis of politics, of power, of ideology. What is ideology? By the same scholar, it is a set of normative beliefs and values that form the basis of political, economic and social life. It's not necessarily a pejorative word, a negative word. An ideology is just a set of beliefs and values, core values that are the basis of the worldview of political, economic, social life. Probably every person has an ideology they agree with, and more than one they don't agree with. But it doesn't mean that if you call something an ideology, it is a slur, it is a pejorative word. So one of those grand narratives mentioned by Lyotard is the Enlightenment, and let's look very briefly at what it was. So the Enlightenment, also called the Age of Reason, happened roughly in the 18th century in Europe, between, roughly speaking, 1715, that is the death of King Louis XIV, and the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789. This was a very powerful movement, ideological movement. This was the time of a scientific revolution, so a period of rapid progress in science, in technology. This was the period of a lot of intellectual and philosophical discussion. There were literary salons, academies. There was a massive influx of printed books, and generally the intellectual culture, plus some groups and societies, sometimes secret societies, such as the Freemasons, who wanted to influence the society and the world. The ideas of the Enlightenment, as the name itself might suggest, are centered on reason, on on rationality. So what they were about are some propositions such as the separation of church and state. So the creation of a secular society and especially the secular government. The intellectuals connected with the Enlightenment were usually against the absolute monarchy, so the kind of monarchy that Louis XIV embodied in France. Not necessarily against the monarchy as such, but definitely the unchecked monarchy, the absolute monarchy that would dictate the rules to the people, and also against the dogmatic church, especially the Catholic Church. Again, in France, this is the intellectual movement that was most evident, was most developed in France. So of course the Catholic Church was very powerful, was strongly connected to absolute monarchy, was strongly connected to the government and the social life before the French Revolution. So it became one of the objects of criticism of the Enlightenment. They were going back to classical antiquity, to classical philosophy. That's why you have quite a lot of Greek and Latin phrases and mottos, such as the one given here: sapere aude, dare to know, dare to think and make your own conclusions. The result of this kind of thinking was the outbreak of the French Revolution, which was in reaction to the political and financial crisis of the policy of King Louis XVI in France. So what happened, again, we could talk a lot about the history of the French Revolution, and if you are interested, I strongly encourage you to Google this subject, to read some books, to watch a documentary film perhaps on the history of French Revolution. What happened then was first of all the abolition of feudalism. So a completely new system was created, which it's the cat. Which broke away with feudalism, and there was the Declaration of the Rights of Man, so the beginning of modern democracy, if you think about that. But very quickly the revolution degenerated into very brutal and violent reign of terror, with persecution of people, with mass executions by the guillotine, with persecution of the Catholic Church and the people connected with the Catholic Church. So this is quite a well-known phrase, that the revolution eats her own children, and in this case definitely this is what happened. The situation was resolved by the rise of Napoleon and the end of democracy. Napoleon crowned himself emperor, and actually Europe entered the age of Napoleonic Wars, ended by the defeat of Napoleon by the European coalition at Waterloo. So here we have an illustration showing the reign of terror, showing the king being flogged and persecuted. Of course, as you remember, his head was chopped off, so he was beheaded at the guillotine. The same happened to Queen Marie Antoinette, and the situation very quickly deteriorated. However, some lasting results of the French Revolution appeared in Europe, not only in France but generally in Europe, including also Britain. So it will be important for the study of the 19th century, for the study of modernity. This is, some say, the beginning of the rise of the middle class. So especially in England, which became the most technologically advanced country in the world in the 19th century. So the French Revolution gave the middle class, that is the city dwellers, the bourgeois, as the French would say. So the educated city dwellers who would work performing all kinds of clerical jobs, so office jobs. There were shopkeepers and tradespeople. The Industrial Revolution, which was happening mostly in England, it started in England from the middle of the 18th century, gave them economic power. The French Revolution gave them political power, because even though Britain did not suffer the reign of terror the way that France did, the political climate changed tremendously, and the political demands of the middle class had to be fulfilled if the government wanted to avoid the violence of the revolution. So what we have in the early 19th century are two massive factors in the social, political, cultural life. That is the industrialization and the urbanization. The whole economy of Britain and other countries that followed it is completely changed from the agricultural model to the industrial model. So we have the industrialization of the economy and the urbanization of society, mass migration of people from the country to the cities, the rapid growth of cities and the urban lifestyle, and everything that happened later is really the result of that. So if we talk about the 19th century and about the modern times, actually modernity is sometimes modern history. If you think of this concept in historical studies, this means the 19th century and later. So for historians, modernity, modern history, starts after the French Revolution. So mostly because of the rise of the middle class, because of the industrialization and urbanization. What follows is the development of the middle class society, the society dominated by the middle class. Of course, the middle class was not the most numerous social class in the 19th century. It would still be the working class, the workers, especially in the industrialized society. But the middle class dominates through their education. They have a monopoly on education, if you think about that. Through religion, especially Protestant religion, like the Church of England in Britain, through the parliament, so parliamentary democracy favors the middle class, so they have lawmaking. Through science and culture, literature, this increasingly becomes the aspect of social life produced by the middle class for the middle class. In 1837, young Queen Victoria comes to the throne, and within a few decades we have the fully blown Victorian society. So something that is still very influential in modern history, especially because this is the fully grown middle class society. So much so that Victoria was sometimes called the middle class queen, because she had to follow the set of middle class values, which are the Victorian values. So the middle class value system is based on industrialization and urbanization. So before the French Revolution, it was the aristocratic system, the aristocratic value system that was dominant. It was based on honor, it was based on loyalty, still in this kind of feudal way of seeing things. In the middle class value system, what is really important is the different modes of production and consumption. So first of all, work ethos, the fact that if you are in the middle class, you have to work. You are not a landowner, you are not receiving rent from your tenants, you have to work. You can be quite rich and you can be very influential, but still you have to work. And that's the mode of production, through work. It could be physical, it could more often be more type of office work that would produce the income and livelihood, but there is no option of not working at all. The other thing is the new mode of consumption. So the home becomes really a place where you spend money, or for which you spend money, rather where you earn. As it was earlier, let's say in rural societies, people generally worked from home. If you had animals, if you had a field, it was usually very near to your home, and the whole family was engaged in working together. In the urban model of life, you don't work from home if you are a middle class person. So what we have are two very important sets of values, which is work ethos and family ethos. So the workplace and the family home become really important aspects, and they are given the moral meaning. So what I mean by work ethos, I mean the values such as self-help, that is, try to be self-sufficient, try to educate yourself, be interested in perpetual learning. This is really what the Victorians believed self-help was. Hard work, punctuality. So everything that makes a Victorian person, mostly a Victorian man as you'll see, a good business partner, a good worker, reliable, punctual, honest, loyal to the workplace. The other side of Victorian values is connected with family life, with sexual morality. So how to be a good wife and mother, also a husband and a father, but as you'll see in a moment, this is more important for women. So fidelity, marital fidelity especially, care for children, being a good homemaker, all these family values that are connected with domestic life. Why do I say that work ethos is more connected with men and family ethos with women? This is because of probably central concept of Victorian values, that is the concept of the division of spheres. So in theory, these values were the same for everybody, men and women. In practice, this is very strongly connected with gender difference. So there are, in practice, different ideals and virtues for men and women. Because men in the upper middle class, so the financially secure, financially wealthy middle class, the idea was that men worked outside of home, so their life was connected with professional life and business and earning money, and basically the life outside of home, more competitive, more ruthless if you think about the 19th century workplace. And women, ideally, if the family could afford it, did not work outside home. They were homemakers, mothers. They could be the managers of the household, especially because richer households employed servants. So there would be actually servants living within the household to serve the family on the daily basis. And in rich households, it could be quite a lot of money. The housemaids for cleaning, the nursery maids and nurses and nannies for the children, the cook for, of course, cooking, sometimes with the help of kitchen maids. Also, men servants such as the butler, who would be like the manager of the household, the footman, who would do more tiresome and let's say labor-intensive things around the house. So the non-working wife would eventually become a kind of manager of the household. But the idea was that work ethos is more applicable to men, and the family ethos is more applicable to women. If we look at 19th century culture, literature and paintings such as the one which is shown here by a Victorian painter, Charles West Cope, not a very famous name nowadays, but quite a successful painter in his own time. If you look at the title of this painting, Life Well Spent, and we have the quintessential Victorian woman in her household. So she is shown inside her home, she is shown with her children, instructing the children. As you can see, she's kind of multitasking. She's doing all the things at the same time. So knitting and reading a book apparently, and talking to her children, especially the boys. So of course there is this kind of gender difference present already in the upbringing of children. And there is a daughter at her feet who is already learning to be an ideal Victorian woman, soon probably. So she is reading a book and minding the baby in the cradle. So this is really something that became very important, and it's something that is referred to, especially by conservative politicians, even nowadays, as an ideal, the Victorian values. This is something that Mrs. Thatcher was very fond of, and in her political speeches she would talk a lot about the necessity of returning to Victorian values, which means work ethos and family ethos, really. So moving back to our discussion of politics, so how this all developed and how it's still influential. This is the moment when I encourage you to take a test online, a free anonymous test online on the web page, which is called the Political Compass. Here you have the web address for that, and if you haven't done it so far, absolutely stop the video and do the test now. It's quite interesting. It's just several pages of questions concerning all kinds of everyday issues, and also social, moral, economic questions that you are asked to have an opinion on, and in the end they will give you your positioning on this kind of grid, which is not only left versus right, but also authoritarian versus libertarian setting on the political spectrum. So it's not only left versus right, we'll talk about the difference in a little moment, but also the other social scale. So it's the left, right, and the economic scale, and authoritarian libertarian on the social scale. So you will probably find yourself somewhere. You'll definitely find yourself somewhere, and this might be useful if you, especially if you don't think you have political opinions, because everybody has political opinions. Some people are just not aware of that yet. Speaking of left and right, this is something that is quite well differentiated by the ideals of the French Revolution. So freedom and equality. So liberté, fraternité, and égalité. So we don't have the fraternity here, but we have equality and freedom. And generally speaking, and what I want to say here is that I don't think that any of these political stances, especially on the economic scale, is wrong, morally wrong. I don't think there is a moral value in left-wing or right-wing views. There could be moral people on both sides of the spectrum and immoral people as well. I would say that the danger lies somewhere else, and we'll get to that very soon. But if we look at the left-wing politics, this is the kind of politics more interested in the concept of equality. So leveling the differences between people through imposition of equality. The right-wing politics is more concerned with the concept of freedom, usually individual, personal freedom, also market freedom, freedom of choice, freedom to buy something, individual responsibility, of course, as a result of freedom. But these two general concepts are both very noble and very moral, and you have to decide for yourself whether you are more in favor of freedom or equality, or perhaps whether you would be more willing to sacrifice a little of your own freedom for somebody else's equality, or the other way around, to sacrifice a little bit of your own equality for somebody else's freedom. So this is perhaps a kind of personal choice that you can make to decide whether you personally are more on the left-hand side or right-hand side of the political spectrum. But now, before we move on, stop and take the test at the political compass, and then we continue. So continuing the subject of the political parties, the left and the right, and also the British context. Well, we are here at the English Studies Institute, so of course we'll be talking quite a lot about Britain and other English-speaking countries such as the United States. But let's now talk at the political parties in Britain from a historical perspective, and especially the fact that from the 18th century onwards, so from the Age of Reason, from the Age of Enlightenment onwards, there has developed a very clear two-party system in Britain, which has been in operation ever since. So it's more or less the distinction between the left and the right wing, and let's see how it was originally. So originally in the 18th century, when the political parties started to form in Britain, there were two parties, the Tories and the Whigs. That's the spelling, the Tories and the Whigs. The Tories were a bit more conservative and the Whigs were a bit more liberal. So the Tories would be a bit more to the right. They were both more or less in the center. They were not extreme in any way. But the Tories were more to the right of the spectrum, the Whigs a little bit more to the left. Later in the 19th century they changed their names, so the Tories became the Conservative Party and the Whigs became the Liberal Party. As you can see, there is no Labour Party yet because it was established in the in the early 20th century, and it more or less replaced the Liberal Party as a bit more radically left option, so something more concerned with equality than freedom. The Conservative Party are more or less direct descendants of the Tories, and further towards the right-hand side of the spectrum. What were the Tories or the Conservatives about in Britain in the 18th century, in the 19th century, and later? So originally the Tories opted for strong monarchy. They supported the landowners, so personal property, especially of the great landowners, and they supported the Church of England. So that's the original set of causes that they supported in the 19th century. In the Victorian period, they would also support the colonial expansion, so the building of the British Empire. We'll talk about the British Empire in a few weeks' time, so there will be more about that. The Whigs, on the other hand, so the Liberal Party, were in favor of strong parliament, so not the strong monarchy, but the parliament, the check on the monarchy. They supported the middle class rather than the landowners, so the social class that needed to work for their livelihood rather than to rely on ownership and renting of land. And in religious disputes, they supported the non-conformist, that is, other Protestant denominations rather than the established church, so the Church of England, which was supported by the monarchy. In the 19th century, they would favor social progress within Britain rather than continuing colonial expansion. So as you can see, hopefully already, this is the difference between the left and the right of the political spectrum, even though, as I say, they were both in the center. They were not radical in any way. What do we have here are some concepts that are very important for Western and especially British politics, such as liberalism, with some names like John Locke. You met him already. That's the man who came up with the concept of tabula rasa. So that's the liberal philosopher and politician. So he supported the limitation of the power of the monarchy for the benefit of the middle class, so very much Whig philosophy here. He believed in the social contract and religious tolerance, especially religious tolerance towards other Protestant denominations. The social contract is a very important concept of the Enlightenment. It believes, proposes that the power, the distribution of power in the society comes from the people, comes from the society itself. It's not God-given, for example, as the traditionalists would think earlier on. So that the whole social structure with the king, with the aristocracy, with the clergy, it's like basically the kingdom of heaven translated into secular terms. For the liberals, this was all the matter of social contract. That is, people decided it worked, and so it started. So the distribution of power has nothing divine in it. Some more names: Adam Smith, the father of economics as a field of study. He wrote a very important book called The Wealth of Nations. in the late 18th century, he is quite remembered for the phrase, the invisible hand of the market. So he believed that free market economy is the best and the market would regulate itself. So as you can see, liberalism, it's taken from liberty and freedom, but it mostly means free market. The economic structure of the society in the 18th century, in the 19th century especially, was the development of capitalism, and this is what we are left with even today. Capitalism means the development of wealth, basically. There are two sides to the capitalist society. These are the owners of capital, the capitalists themselves, the owners of factories, for example, the owners of the modes of production, and they are motivated by profit. The rest are the workers. Sometimes the word proletariat is used. We'll talk about it in a moment. And they are motivated by the perspective of hunger. So basically, the owners want the profit, the workers just want the wages so they would not starve. The system provides quite effective production of goods, but the distribution of these goods is not equal. It's quite unjust if you think about that, because the people who actually produce these goods get the least of them, and it almost all goes back to the capitalists. So some capitalists were moved by the dramatic situation of the workers. If you know anything about the history of the 19th century, and especially the living conditions and working conditions of the factories and factory workers, they were appalling. They were absolutely horrible, and the way these people lived and the way they had to work was tragic in every sense. So the perspective of hunger and starvation was very literal. It's not just some sort of figure of speech. It was absolutely literal. And some people who fell through the cracks of the system were literally starving to death in the streets. So some of the rich industrialists, some capitalists, were moved by this situation, and they came up with the solution, which was called paternalism. Pater means the father in Latin, so it's like treating the workers as your children. So this kind of beneficial father, the benevolent father of the workers. So here we have some names. Like Henri de Saint-Simon or Charles Fourier in France, and in Britain. Some industrialists, especially early, was the one called Robert Owen. They came up with something that was called utopian socialism. Socialism, of course, means society, so giving some benefits back to the workers, to the society. And what those industrialists were trying to do in Britain, and there are quite a few UNESCO sites connected with this trend now, like New Lanark, which was to form model villages, to form like the situation, the environment in which the workers would both live and work in cooperation, in friendship, and good social interaction. So they would build not only factories, but they would build entire villages, like New Lanark in Scotland, built by Robert Owen, with a school, with cultural programs, with a church, very often with some sort of common rooms and shops and everything. So they would create like the entire little society for the workers to improve their living conditions. So that's the early 19th century. That's the first half of the 19th century, really, when these ideas start to be developed. Of course, not all industrialists followed the program and believed in paternalism. So with the rapid growth of the economy, with the rapid growth of the industry, the living conditions of the workers were getting even worse. And this is what inspired a young German intellectual of Jewish origin called Karl Marx, who came to Britain, who lived in London, who had a very close friend, Friedrich Engels, whose family had an actual factory in Britain. This was a German family, but they were rich and they had a factory in England. So young Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels could observe the living and working conditions of the working class, of the proletariat, as they called them, very close, and they were, of course, appalled, as you might expect any morally thinking person would. So they tried to think of another solution, something else than this utopian socialism that depended on the goodwill of the rich. They tried to change the system. So what they really thought was that capitalism as a system of economy is essentially bad, and it basically should be abolished. What drove the moral badness of this system was, according to Karl Marx, and here you have the image of Marx as a young man, because everybody remembers him as kind of old man with a big beard, but he was young like everybody at some point. So he believed that what drives this system is the irresolvable conflict between the capitalists and the workers. So it's like two sides, and you cannot reach the peaceful agreement because their motivations and their aims are so completely opposed. He believed that the oppression can only be eliminated through the abolition of social classes and private property. And the only way to do it, in his view, was through revolution. So revolution meaning the kind of revolution that happened in France, a bloody uprising that would overthrow the entire system of the world. So that's what he believed in, that's what he proposed. He noticed that the working class was much more numerous than the middle class, and that the workers could do it, but they were unaware of their power and divided by all kinds of external things like the country, religion, and so on. So you may remember the philosophy of Marx with the base and the superstructure, with the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. This is the political views of Marx. So he wanted to, first of all, educate the workers and make them aware of their own power, to overcome the divisions among the workers, so overcome the loyalties to things like the nation or religion. It's like the workers of the world unite. This is a very famous quotation from the Communist Manifesto, which he published with Friedrich Engels, as you can see, in 1848. The problem is that they never thought what would happen after the revolution. They had no practical solutions and no ideas. They believed the revolution should happen, it's inevitable, and it would overthrow the old world. But what would happen later? Not really. They said probably collectivism, probably sharing of everything, so communism as a kind of shared property of everything and total equality and total anarchy, if you think about that, and centrally planned economy. So there would be the government and they would dictate what should be produced and how it should be distributed. As you will see, this was the idea that some people found very inspirational, and if you know anything about the history of the 20th century, much of the horrors of the 20th century can be attributed to taking Marxist ideas literally and trying to fulfill his postulates. However, there were other ways to improve the society, because nobody was really saying like, we want poverty, we want people dying in the street, we want squalor, we are happy because it means more profits for us. No, in some places like Germany or Britain, for that matter, there was another attempt to change the society through social democracy. So either through parliamentary reform, such as in Germany, you have the names of Ferdinand Lassalle or Wilhelm Liebknecht, who were social democrats. They were definitely not Marxists and communists, but they were very favored towards the political reform within the parliamentary system. And in Britain we have quite a large wave of in the second half of the 19th century of social democrats, such as William Morris, for example, the founder of the arts and crafts movement, which was a kind of socialist utopia of returning to handmade goods rather than machine production. There was quite a lot of political thought, like the Labour Party with its first leader James Keir Hardie and Fabian Society, who believed in democratic social reform. So it's all gradual, it's all through evolution rather than revolution. And actually the Labour Party, which was established in the year 1900, they gained popularity among the working class, and in 1924 they had their first Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, so first Labour Prime Minister. So this is definitely moving the political spectrum in Britain more towards the left, but gradually and not through revolution. There was, however, one country that became completely infatuated with Marx and his theories of revolution, and this was Russia. So the Russian Revolution is like the revolution that ends the long 19th century, in a similar way that the French Revolution started it. So here we have a bit of information about the Russian Revolution, because it will be so important for the 20th century, for the modernity and for the political spectrum. So the two names that probably everybody heard are Vladimir Lenin and his collaborator and later successor Joseph Stalin. And here you have these two politicians and dictators on the Russian painting, and Lenin generally thought that the proletariat, the workers, have been bribed, so they are unable to start the revolution because they are too worried about the money they are getting, even though the money is very bad. So who is going to do the revolution? And the answer by Lenin, which he which he postulated in the essay he published entitled "What is to be Done" in 1902, was that of course we need professional revolutionists. So if we want the revolution, we need to have professional revolutionists. Elementary, dear Watson. They followed basically the French idea with all the horrors, and perhaps they even made them more horrible than the French Revolution. So the Russian Revolution started in 1905 with the postulates of constitutional reform. So that there were two revolutions, if you think about it. The first one in 1905. The Russian Revolution, the first Russian Revolution, which started as the French Revolution did. So to abolish the monarchy and to introduce constitutional reform. For Lenin and his group, this was not enough. So they started the second revolution, the famous October Revolution in 1917. Which very quickly degenerated into terror, hunger, and war. In 1920, they tried to invade Poland to spread the ideas of revolution. Poland, as you can see, in 1920 was a very young country, which has just emerged as an independent state. We'll talk about it in a moment. And luckily for us, probably, Polish troops managed to defend the country against the Soviet Russians. Soviet, it means it's the Russian word for the type of government, the type of councils that were organized in Russia. After the death of Lenin in 1924, the new dictator of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, tried to limit the territorial expansion. He believed in what he called socialism in one country. This country was, of course, Soviet Union. And he, first of all, tried to introduce the centrally planned economy. So it didn't really work, but this is what they started, and he started an even worse reign of terror that happened after Lenin's revolution. So there was the Great Purge with up to 1 million victims. In the 1930s, there were all kinds of repressions and basically states organized terror with mass murders, with the concentration camps, and some horrible, absolutely horrible atrocities committed by the Russian government, by the dictator and his forces against their own citizens. So that's the things like the Holodomor in the Ukraine, with again millions of people dying horribly of starvation and cold. If you know anything about Ukraine, it's one of the most agriculturally fertile regions of the world, and to introduce hunger that would kill millions of people there, it was, I would say, something unusual even for the Russian standards. But this was something that Stalin would do. So to introduce a completely new form of government, a completely new state, and everything, including art, as you can see. So yeah, that's the moment to stop, and we continue in a while. At the same time, if you remember, I told you about the regaining of independence by Poland. This was the result of something that was happening throughout the 19th century, and especially in the second half of the 19th century. That is the rise of nationalisms. So the rise of national awareness, of national groups living within larger entities such as the Russian Empire or the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Ottoman Empire, or the countries that were not unified, that were completely divided into smaller sections, like the Italian or German states. So the rise of nationalism, the rise of national identity, this is something that you may remember about Poland in the 19th century, with Romanticism, with Positivism. So the idea of recreating national awareness and the dream of re-establishing the nation state during the time of partition and the time when Poland was not on the maps of the world. So here we have a painting by Teofil Kwiatkowski, Chopin's Polonaise. It's a very romantic idea with some angels, with some historical figures from the history of Poland, all reacting to this beautiful music by Chopin, which is also inspired by Polish folk music. So it's like recreating the Polish spirit. This was absolutely crucial for Poland, and that is why the culture, literature, painting, music of Poland in the 19th century is so deeply focused on regaining independence, because, well, if you cannot have independence, you're basically quite unable to focus on something else, on the things that were, for example, so important for the Western culture, especially in Britain. But what I would like to show to you now is that Poland was not the only country in this situation. There were, first of all, new countries in Europe emerging, like Italy in the middle of the 19th century, and Germany slightly later in the early 70s. These were the countries that were unified out of small princedoms, kingdoms, and other units. And there were more countries in the situation similar to Poland. So with the they were subjugated by major empires such as Russia or the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, or Austria-Hungary, or then the German Empire as well. So countries like Greece, Serbia, Poland, of course, Romania, Bulgaria, they were all trying to regain independence. That is why the Polish cause had some resonance in Europe, for example in Britain, together with other nations, such as Bulgaria, as Greece, and other, especially the Balkan states that were subjugated by the Ottoman Empire. And all these countries were regaining their independence as nation states, so they were focused on national identity rather than any other political identity, especially in the interwar period and after the First World War. So the First World War brought the end to the old system of large empires and gave the opportunity for these new nation states to develop. So here we have the right-hand side, we have the freedom side. As with Russia, they went all the way to the left. With the nationalists, with the nation states, they were moving more and more towards the right of the spectrum. And some countries, like Italy and Germany, that were unified in the 19th century were moving quite to the extreme of the right-hand side of the system. That is, they were moving towards fascism. So we have the communism on the extreme left and fascism on the extreme right. So what is fascism? So fascism is, first of all, authoritarian ideology, opposed to everything else. Liberalism, Marxism, anarchism. The very important elements of fascism are one-party state, so they try to eliminate any kind of political discussion, any kind of opposition. Strong charismatic leader. This is the political system that believes in the leader, in the guide. You can call him Duce in Italian, you can call him Führer in German. Some other countries like Spain and Portugal were going in the same direction, so strong charismatic leader. Another very important aspect, aggressive militarism. This is a violent state, because if you want to have an authoritarian system, you need to keep the potential opposition in check through violence. So that's what you have. The situation with fascism is quite complex. It's not like everything is right-wing. Definitely the political views are very conservative and right-wing. So things like nationalism, traditional gender roles, this is something they would take straight from the Victorians. Very often religious beliefs, because what the extreme right loves is the hierarchical society. So they take basically natural hierarchies in human society and they turn the volume to 11. Like they go all the way with creating authoritarian hierarchical structures. However, with the economic tactics, they quite often go left-wing. So planned economy and redistribution of goods. So this is something that communism and fascism have together. They do not believe in the way that, let's say, the societies will regulate themselves. No way. Authoritarianism. That's really the most important aspect of both these extreme political views. So what we have is, of course, the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany. In Germany, it developed quickly into something called the Nazism, which is short for National Socialism. It wasn't socialism. Well, it was socialist in the economic sense and nationalistic in the social sense. So a very radical version of fascism with some added elements. Anti-Semitism, racism, and basically being against everything modern, against modern art, against, abstract art. They thought it was just degenerate and horrible. They were creating something which they called the state religion, which was a combination of paganism, Christianity, and nationalism. So, here we have a quotation from one of the left-wing political thinkers of contemporary times, Slavoj Žižek, and I think it really sums up fascism very well. He said that fascism is a conservative revolution. Think about that. Conservative revolution. So it's very authoritarian, it's violent, it's militaristic, but at the same time it's conservative in being nationalistic and traditionalist. Next slide shows you the political spectrum is kind of continuity. So we have in the center, we have the democratic systems in blue, and on both sides we have the extremes where democracy is replaced by dictatorship. They are in the red. perhaps because they are dangerous. They are very dangerous, and extreme left wing and extreme right wing are not very different in terms of economy, in terms of terror and violence that they promote. So in the middle we have the socialism and conservatism, so kind of left center, right center. This is perhaps where the American political parties fall, with the Democrats a little bit to the left, opting for social change and some sort of parliamentary socialism, and Republicans a bit more to the right, opting for the status quo, so for the preservation of the current situation, and political conservatism. This is, in the blue, this is still types of democratic system, and what really is important in social life to prevent is the blue going out to the red, so to extreme left wing and communism, and extreme right wing and fascism. If you are still not convinced about the similarities between communism and fascism, they are both totalitarian. They both are very violent in the military sense. They have the secret police, censorship, propaganda, so they try to take over the entire culture. They always place the state, so the collective identity, above the individual. So they are always focused on the group, focused on the collective. For the fascist, for the extreme right wing, it would very often be nation or religion. For the communist, it very often would be the social class. They have different, let's say, points of focus. But the idea that the group morality is more important than the individual is absolutely crucial for both extreme right wing and extreme left wing. Okay, and this is what led in the 20th century, after the Second World War, to the polarization of the world and the creation of the Western Bloc with the USA and NATO, and the Eastern Bloc with the Soviet Union and the satellite countries. And if you look at the map of the world from the situation after the Second World War to the fall of communism in 1989, this is how it was. So the Western democratic countries in blue, and the dictatorial satellite countries of the USSR in red. So this is really the situation that was achieved after the war. So that's really the political background of what was happening in culture, in literature, in social studies, and the humanities in the 20th century. And what I would like to show you now is the group of scholars called the Frankfurt School, who developed in the interwar period in Germany. These were the group of scholars. As you can see, you have some names here: Mark Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, Erich Fromm, Herbert Marcuse. Here you have the images of these scholars. They were all Germans, but more often than not, almost all of them had Jewish ancestry. So when the Nazis were gaining popularity in Germany, they had to flee from the country, and they first went to Geneva, then they went to the United States, finding work very often at the universities there. So New York, Columbia University or Berkeley University in California. Some of them returned to Germany after the war in the 50s, but some, like Herbert Marcuse, stayed in the USA until the end of his academic career and his life. So these were the scholars that were initially fascinated with Marx and his concepts of the society, and especially the central concept of the inherent conflict being the driving force of the society. So they were looking for the evidence of such dualities, such conflicts in modern culture. Adorno was a musicologist and sociologist. Erich Fromm was a psychoanalyst. Horkheimer and Marcuse were philosophers. So basically they were looking at culture, especially modern popular culture and social relations, to find these dualities that would be similar to the duality that Marx observed between the capitalists and the proletariat. But this is really Marxism without the economy. They are not really interested in the production of goods or distribution of goods in the factories and workers and such thing. What they are interested in is society. So they are usually credited or blamed. They are still very controversial if you think about that, for two things that happened in the second half of the 20th century: the sexual revolution and the beginning of the critical theory. So what they observed is that traditional family, education, religion and work are oppressive because they are based on the conflict. So the conflict between authority and freedom, parents and children, teachers and students, morality and sex, work and play, productivity and creativity. You can actually think about such dualities probably yourself, and if you think about it, they all boil down to one thing: the conflict between nature and culture. And for the members of the Frankfurt School, nature is good and culture is bad. So they go all the way back to Rousseau. So Rousseau's idea that nature was created perfect and men started to meddle with it and they spoiled it. There you have it. In the modern world, nature good, culture bad. So what would they find? They would find oppression everywhere, in daily life, in families, in the workplace, in the church, in the school, in all kinds of institutions of social life. They believe that family is based on punishment and authority very often, rather than let's say positive inspiration or whatever. They believed that the school system is based on, again, intimidation, punishment, and very often some sort of psychological violence. The same happens in the church. If you look at the Protestant churches, if you look at the Catholic Church, there is a lot of blaming, there is a lot of shame, there is a lot of authoritarian violence again. And for the members of the Frankfurt School, it all led in one direction: to the horrors of the Second World War, to the horrors of the concentration camps. Remember, most of them were Jewish, so even if they managed to escape from Europe, dominated by the Nazis, many members of their families, friends, social groups were murdered during the Holocaust. So one of the questions that the scholars grouped in the Frankfurt School were asking themselves was, how on earth could this happen? Why the people allowed it? Why so many millions of innocent people, Jews and other victims of the Nazis died so horribly in those concentration camps, which were basically like factories for producing death. And in 1850, Theodor Adorno and some others, collaborators, they published a very important book in which they tried to answer this question. The book was entitled The Authoritarian Personality. And you may want to Google it, especially the concept of the F scale, F for fascist. They believed that it's within the human nature to conform to authoritarian power, and they wanted to find scientific proof, psychological proof, that this wasn't some sort of strange aberration that allowed the concentration camps to happen, that this is something that most people have in their own personality. And what they developed was this kind of psychological test that would test anyone. You could try to take it on the F scale, that is the scale of complacency towards the authoritarian state. So if we are submitted to authoritarian state, would we rebel? They believed not likely. So what they measured was, first of all, conventionalism, conventional thinking, stereotypes, and basically kind of easy consumerist attitude towards culture. Authoritarian submission. So, are you easily bullied? Authoritarian aggression. Can you turn into a bully? And it's actually easier than you think. Anti-intellectualism, meaning the cult of power, the cult of physical strength, the cult of the leader. Superstition. Stereotypy, it means the kind of stereotypical thinking. Do you look for easy answers? The cult of power and toughness, this kind of very often gender roles, a kind of masculine man who is physically strong, who is aggressive and dominant. Exaggerated concerns over sex, because sexuality is generally the area of freedom for most people on kind of social scale. If it's confronted with obsessions of the authoritarian institutions, it's a very strong indication that the society is going towards authoritarianism. So as you can see, this is a psychological treatment because the members of the school were actually trying to combine Marx and Freud together. So economic repression was translated into the language of psychological repression. And here we have some more works, for example, by Erich Fromm, which he produced with Horkheimer, called Authority and the Family. It was about the authoritarian systems of Western traditional patriarchal family. They believe something needs to be done about that. We need to change the personal relations within the family system, because it perpetuates this authoritarian personality. Then we have some psychoanalysts who try to develop that, especially a student of Freud, a psychoanalyst called Wilhelm Reich, who wrote two very important books, more, but the Sexual Revolution, this is the most important one by him, and he was an interesting character. He was doing all kinds of crazy experiments, and he believed that he discovered something that he called orgon, which was like the natural sexual energy, but not really in humans, but in nature itself. So it's something like the energy of life that is kind of permeating the entire universe. He believed he could make rain, for example, with that. He was building some sort of crazy machines that would make rain. So if there was a period of drought, you could just aim it at the clouds and the rain would come. Not happening, unfortunately, but he was trying at least. So they are quite interested in the area of sexuality as the area of freedom, and especially as opposed to patriarchal society and patriarchal family, perpetuated by the system of education, perpetuated by religion, mostly Christian religion, because they were coming from Europe, of course. So Herbert Marcuse wrote Eros and Civilization in 1955. Again, they believed that sexuality is the most basic human instinct, and that culture, through its institutions, sublimates the sexual instinct into productivity. So this could be creative, this could be beneficial for the society, but the capitalist states really want to channel this vital energy of the people into production of goods. So they repress sexual freedom, they repress the instinct, so it causes frustration, it causes suffering. So that's what we have. And they started observing that even before the war, in the interwar period, in the 20s. So this was after the Russian Revolution, but not before the fascist gain of power. So this was quite interesting, especially if they compared the treatment of sexuality in the Soviet Union and in the United States of America when they immigrated there. In America, it was the swinging 20s, so the age of jazz, the age of relative loosening of sexual morality and greater freedom. The situation in Russia was different and quite interesting, and we'll talk about it in a moment. So continuing with sex in the USSR. Shortly after the revolution, actually the communists allowed sexual liberation. So in the 1920s in Russia, if you look at the history of the early Soviet Union, there was a very visible emancipation of women because they could add to the productivity of the nation. There was greater sexual liberation, visible, for example, by easy divorce, because this was against the church, so to counteract the social influence of mostly the Orthodox Church, the decriminalization of homosexuality. So the sexual energy of the nation, and especially of the workers, was liberated to help the Soviet state. However, when Stalin came to power, he reintroduced more Puritan morality. So while in the USA they were having the swinging 20s with jazz and more liberated social relationships. In Russia, what we have is, for example, this poster glorifying the communist family. So we have the return to patriarchal family, return to the traditionalist traditionalist system of family life, centered on the subjugation of women to men, centered on reproduction and producing children for the country, basically. So that's quite interesting, because it seems like the Russians initially wanted to liberate the workers in terms of their sexuality, and then very soon they realized that too much liberation would be dangerous for the authoritarian state. So there you go. What happens in America in the interwar period? So we have the American dream. We have mass immigration. We have the belief that hard work brings real prosperity and freedom at the individual level. So this idea from a shoeshine boy to the millionaire. So here we have a cartoon from this period of a hard-working poor boy, hard-working because he believes he can enrich himself and improve his situation in the world. So we have the young, dynamic, liberal society, and even the great crisis of 1929 did not completely overthrow this optimism of the American dream. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt introduced his New Deal policy in the 1930s, and the economy started to build back. However, they followed to some extent, not as much as the Russians, but they followed the idea of limiting the amount of sexual freedom and sexual instinct in the society, to channel it towards the state. And here we have the last slide for today, the image about the motion picture production code, which was in operation from the 1930s to the youth revolution in the 60s. So this was the system of censorship in the movies. So here we have a pre-code image from a movie with this voluptuous actress in a rather provocative pose. Later on, the system actually censored things like sexual activity or nudity. Even naked children were forbidden in movies. Naked children who are not sexualized, and this like the image of innocence, really. No too much nudity. Contraception was outlawed. You couldn't make any allusions to this in the films. Actual childbirth was not allowed. White slavery, they had no problems with black slavery, but white slavery, no. Interracial sexual relations. So even flirting, even holding hands by the people of different races. Profanity meant as swearing, basically, swear words. The ridicule of clergy, so strengthening the religious authority. Drug use, excessive violence. Excessive means basically you could show violence if it served the moral good. So that's what we have here. The left and the right, the freedom and equality and the democracy and dictatorship. And we continue with this subject next week in the context of modernity and modern life. That is the second half of the 20th century and later. Thank you.